Boa tarde. Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Boa tarde a todos. Como vocês estão? É um grande prazer hoje. Estamos nós aqui, três, eu, Andréa Kogan, assistente acadêmica do Laboratório de Política, Comportamento e Mídia da Fundação São Paulo, PUC São Paulo, professora Adriana Novaes e professor Roger Berkowitz, da Hannah Arendt Center. Eu não vou falar muito hoje, só vou agradecer muito pela Adriana por ter feito o convite ao professor Roger, por ser uma grande parceira do Labô. Inclusive, dona Adriana vai ministrar um curso conosco que já está aberto a partir de 18 de novembro. Depois eu coloco todas as informações, gente, porque eu estou muito nervosa com esse curso, que estou muito animado com esse curso. Mas, para não deixar o professor Roger esperando, eu gostaria de dizer que é uma honra receber os nossos convidados internacionais aqui, principalmente ele. Boa tarde a todos. Vocês estão me ouvindo bem? Eduarda, Gilberto, Denise, Renata, Carol, Flavinha, dupla dinâmica. Oba, eu e a Adriana já somos... André e Adriana, é uma dupla dinâmica, é uma dupla sertaneja, como vocês quiserem. A palestra hoje do professor Roger é Politics Today, Política Hoje, a Challenge to Democracy, um desafio à democracia. A Adriana vai fazer a apresentação, a nossa fala vai ser em inglês, mas fiquem à vontade, se houver necessidade, se vocês entenderem inglês, mas não souberem redigir, podem fazer as perguntas em português, que a gente faz a tradução aqui. Então, desde já, eu agradeço muito a presença de vocês. Thank you so much, Professor Roger. Now Adriana is going to talk. Please, Dri.
Okay. Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, Andrea Kogan.
Yeah.
My dear, and Professor Roger Berkowitz. The Laboratory of Politics, Behavior and Media is honored to have him here, even if it's virtually. It's my pleasure to introduce Roger Berkowitz. He's Professor of Political Studies and Human Rights at Bard College and Academic Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. The center has done remarkable work preserving and spread arts thinking. The center has a stimulating newsletter, offers many activities and events like the virtual reading room and the annual conference in October. This conference deals with deep political issues, menaces to justice and democracy, always from Arendt's work approach. The Hannah Arendt Library is at Bard College with around 4,000 volumes in the Stephenson Library. They've been digitalized and all volumes containing marginalia to be consulted online. The center is a place for bold and risky thinking, as it's written on the website. Berkowitz got his BA from Amherst College and his JD and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of The Gift of Science, Leibniz and the Modern Legal Tradition, co-editor of Thinking in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt on Ethics and Politics. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Book Forum, the Paris Review Online, Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and many others. So without taking any more time from this great occasion, I just want to welcome very warmly Roger Berkowitz to give the lecture, Politics Today, a Challenge to Democracy.
Thank you very much, Adriana and Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here and in Brazil. I wish I could be with you in Brazil, but next time. As both Andrea and Adriana said, we said that I would talk today about politics today, a challenge to democracy. And I'll revise that only by adding one word, because democracy is one of those words that, you know, doesn't mean very much anymore, or we don't know what it means. And so I'll say a challenge to liberal democracy. And let me at least try and say what I mean by that. I think that liberal democracy, as it emerged, you know, not in ancient Greece, but in the 18th and really 19th centuries, has a number of prejudices to it. Prejudices that for many of us, like all prejudices, we think of as good because we share these prejudices. And yet they're prejudices that at times come to endanger or make unpopular and lead to a crisis of liberal democracy. One prejudice, I think, of liberal democracy is that democracy is liberal. I think a lot of people today use democracy almost synonymously with liberal democracy, namely that democracies are societies in which we value individual rights and individual freedoms and individual idiosyncrasies. And yet there's no reason that democracy should be liberal. Even though democracy is based in a kind of respect for the individual in the sense of self-rule, many democracies are quite illiberal. They are mob rule of some sort, or simply a rule of a very close-knit citizenry. The French writer about America, Alexis de Tocqueville, understood about democracies about as well as anyone, and he understood that the spirit of American democracy, as he put it, came out of the townships, these small town halls, these local governments where people would often, come in from their day's work and meet once or twice a year and govern themselves. And what he said is that even though the spirit of democracy came out of these townships were often very illiberal. They were often quite prejudiced, quite limiting. And he says in one of the, I think, most prescient and important quotes from that book, Democracy in America, a very civilized society tolerates only with great difficulty the trials of freedom in the township. Namely, democracy leads to a kind of illiberalism that will often be hard to tolerate by a civilized society. And so one prejudice that I think we have is that democracy is going to lead to a kind of liberalism, and there's certainly no reason to think that it will. Two is that democracy is a kind of rationalist and cosmopolitan project. Again, there's this idea that Democrats, we're told, don't fight wars. Democracies don't fight wars, and that democracies are sort of, not ultra nationalist. They're more rational than that. And yet, as Hannah Arendt reminds us, politics is the gathering of a plurality of people around common experiences and shared beliefs. And from out of that, Arendt well knows that nationalism and other kinds of common creative passions, collective passions and forms of identifications are absolutely at the core of politics. A third prejudice is that today, at least, we imagine those who don't share our liberal and cosmopolitan ideas as moral enemies. We are so sure of our truth that we know the truth as liberal cosmopolitan Democrats that anyone who disagrees with us is not only wrong, but is sort of evil. And this commits, I think, the great fallacy for Arendt to confuse truth and opinion in politics. For her, the essence of politics is that there is no truth to it. There's only opinions. And especially in a democracy where you have a wide range of plural people, the challenge of a democracy is to persuade people to agree on certain basic, fundamental, shared convictions, and then let people live differently. That was how she understood democracy. Whereas today, we think people live differently are often wrong and even evil. And perhaps the strongest prejudice of modern liberal democracies is a prejudice for security over freedom. Today, this largely comes out of the thinking of someone like Thomas Hobbes, who imagines us all as equal and power-seeking protons who want to increase our power, and what we then want to do is somehow set up systems where we are secure and can pursue our liberal goals of getting married, having children, earning a living, and not having to worry about other people taking away what is ours. And so this privileging of security over freedom is at the core of liberalism. And Hannah Arendt saw this in a different way. She said there was a prejudice against politics today. If we understand politics as a kind of freedom, an activity of freedom, she said that in a world of nuclear weapons and terrorism, we are scared out of our minds. I'm using good language here, not what I would use when I teach. We're scared out of our minds of politics because we're scared of what it might lead to nuclear war or terror or destruction. And so we seek to limit politics and avoid politics. And the way we do that, she says, is the creation of technocratic systems of governance, administrative states, bureaucracies, all of which are designed to actually depoliticize our public realm and put in charge experts, intellectuals, as she'll call them, problem solvers, as she'll sometimes call them, who will avoid the danger of politics through turning to a kind of scientific, technocratic knowledge and claim that they can rule and guarantee security and growth and prosperity without the dangers of politics. So these four, what I would call prejudices of liberal democracy, namely the prejudice of that it's liberal and individualist, that it's cosmopolitan and not nationalist, that it seeks truth and sees our opponents as evil rather than plurality in opinions, and that it seeks security over freedom. These four prejudices of liberal democracies today have led to a crisis. And the crisis can be understood in a number of ways, but it's basically that we have created an elite governing class, largely, almost exclusively college educated. 40 or 50 years ago, half of the United States Congress had a college degree. Now, all 100 senators and I think all but one members of the House of Representatives. It's almost inconceivable today that we would elect someone to a major office in this country who doesn't have a college degree. That's an extraordinary change and an extraordinary prejudice in favor of a kind of person who sees the world in a certain way as knowledgeable, as controllable, moldable, and malleable through knowledge. And for Arendt, this is a dangerous change. In the 1960s, she writes a book called Crises of the Republic. It has 3 essays in it, Lying in Politics, Civil Disobedience, and On Violence. But she also writes a number of essays in the 1960s on related themes, Truth in Politics, Home to Roost, and there are a few others. And there are a number of themes in these essays. One theme that unites a lot of these essays is the problem of lying in politics, right? Which is something we've all learned a lot about in the last few years, but she was interested in 50 years ago. And well, what is lying in politics? Well, she says it's not just that politicians tell lies, right? Politicians have always told lies. The real issue for her about lying in politics is that we stop telling lies that are designed to serve some political purpose or serve some political end. The lies cease to have utilitarian purpose in a policy sense. The lies, she says, become part of a PR, public relations scheme. We actually care more about PR and the image than the policy. And in another of these essays, what she says is, the real danger here is not lies. It's that lying has become a way of life. And what does she mean by this, that lying has become a way of life? She means that the corrosive force of lying by government officials, but also by administrators and by academics and by journalists and by pundits and all these people, this corrosive force of lying is found in the use of public relations methods from advertising. They actually are using advertising methods. And while lying has always been part of politics, this new art of lying through public relations has the effect, she says, of separating the people and their leaders from reality. The fading of reality, the loss of reality is what opens the doors to conspiracy theories, logically coherent fictions like that under totalitarianism or movements, and thus totalitarianism. And so a lot of these essays, all of these essays that she writes in the 1960s, this is not something that's been, I don't think, given enough attention. All of these essays are about the way politics is separating itself from reality, separating itself from the real world. I know that Andrea and Labô are about trying to bring real, knowledge to the world and not get caught up in these academic niceties. And what Arendt is saying is, these intellectuals, these pundits, these technocrats are so caught up in theories and so caught up in ideologies and so caught up in game theories and economics and this and that they actually don't pay attention to the world around them. And this is actually, if you read these essays with this in mind, it's sort of shocking to see how angry Hannah Arendt is about intellectuals, how angry she is about the fact that she says the greatest danger to our time is the entrance of intellectuals into government. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement. And it's only gotten worse, right, in the last 50 years. She wrote this in the 1960s. And so I want to talk a little bit about, this is what I'm going to leave you with today and talk about today. I have 5 minutes left or so. A little bit about why Hannah Arendt saw intellectuals to be so dangerous. And by the way, not intellectuals, not all intellectuals, intellectuals in government, intellectuals who enter into the public sphere. You can find this fear of intellectuals in her work all the way back into the 1930s, before she left Germany. In her book, Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewess, which she writes about a Jewish woman, Rahel Varnhagen, who ran a series of salons in Berlin. She says that, Rahel was this average Jew. She wasn't rich, she wasn't cultivated, she wasn't beautiful. She had no weapons, Arendt says, in the struggle for social recognition, and she was Jewish. Bad thing if you want social recognition in 18th century Germany. And so how does someone like Rahel Varnhagen acquire and seek a meaningful life? Arendt says, she learns to lie. She learns she learns to tell a story about herself. She becomes a master of introspection and tell a story of who she is that changes the facts of who she is. And so she sort of denies being Jewish, and she becomes friends with this whole, group of intellectuals and Arendt says she learns to sort of make up a new world. in which she's meaningful and important. And it's this ability and this danger of that Rahel Varnhagen has, of being able to make up a world that Arendt finds so compelling, so powerful, and yet also quite dangerous. At what point Rahel says, facts mean nothing to all to me, right? Every fact can be undone. And Arendt then says that given her renunciations of her factual condition, all she had left was thinking, and she created a life for herself in thought, which Arendt called the mania of thinking. And, you know, for those of you who know Hannah Arendt and know how she's thought of as this quintessential thinker, right, which she is, she understood that thinking was dangerous. And the main danger of thinking is that it can separate us from the world. It can take us out of the world and deny it, which is one of the reasons she says all lying, all politics, all good politicians have to be good liars. Because what does a politician do? There's someone who wants to make changes in the world. There's someone who wants to change the world. And if you want to change the world, you got to deny the facts of the world first so that you can change it. You got to make something new up. And so good politicians are good liars. But her main confrontation with intellectuals and with political liars comes in the 1960s, and it comes out of her engagement with two major events of this time. One is the Vietnam War, and the other is the publication of her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, she was just astonished at what people would say about her book, which she thought had nothing to do with her book. And so she said that in her postscript to the book, which she published later, she says that the people who wrote about her book were partisans with, quote, down-to-earth interests, who therefore try to distort the facts. They were, and she says, these partisans, however, most of them were, quote, with the untrammeled inspirations of intellectuals, who, on the contrary, are not in the least interested in facts, but treat them merely as the springboard for ideas. And so she saw that the opposition to her book came in large measure from intellectuals who had nothing to do with reality and weren't interested in facts, but were just interested in portraying her in a simple way to further their ideas and their ideology. The second was the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War. And she was just aghast when she read the Pentagon Papers about all sorts of lies that made the Vietnam War possible: phony body counts, doctor damage reports, fake progress reports. And that all of this, she says, led to two kinds of lying, right? One kind of lie was the deliberate falsehood, the deliberate mass manipulations of facts and opinion. And that, she says, is propaganda. But the other kind of lie, she says, comes from the presence of intellectuals in the machinery of government. Those intellectual bureaucrats, she says, who are at home in concepts and theories. They are unusually adept at coming to believe in their hypothetical creations over and against the real and factual world. And they have an uncanny ability to deny facts. Okay, why have I gone into this in a paper, in a discussion, a talk on the crisis of liberal democracy? Because much of the crisis of democracy, not only are these four prejudices about the prejudices of truth and of intellectuals and technocrats, but so much of the populist rebellion against liberal democracy today and against democracy today, and whether it's in Brazil or in the United States or elsewhere, is driven by, I think, a not unjustified insight that so much of our political leadership is completely divorced from the real world, is caught up in these theories and these facts. These theories and these ideologies, and they tell the story, and they retell the story of what's happening, not based on the facts of the world, but based on their ideas and the poetic truths that they want to evince. You know, in the United States, 60% of the country, at least, I don't know the exact numbers off today, but somewhere around, still doesn't have a college degree. those people, when they see what the intellectuals say about race or gender or COVID or the impeachment, they think they're nuts. Immigration, the economy. And so there's a reason this democracy is in crisis today. We can come up with economic reasons. We can come up with, all sorts of reasons. And by the way, I think that one of the reasons that it took so long for this crisis to develop was because for 50 years, the economy was largely good. And I think a lot of people said, look, I don't buy this stuff, but as long as I keep getting more money, my kids go to schools, my kids get jobs, we're okay. You do what you want to do. You talk about this stuff over there, we'll just get richer. But once the crisis happened in 2008, 2009, and I think what you see is people saying, you guys have gone nuts, you intellectuals, you people in government. And so, we have to take seriously the fact that in the United States, we have a president who is the greatest liar in the history of the US political world, and yet is seen as a truth teller by 60% of the population. Why is he seen as a truth teller? Because they see us as even bigger liars. They see the people in politics caught up in these images and these PRs and these poetic truths that have no connection to their world, none. And so I guess I'll stop there, and I'm happy to give examples or talk about it. I've had to rush a little bit, but the basic idea here is we have a huge prejudice of liberal democracy that that it fits with what a kind of liberal, intellectual, cosmopolitan imagines democracy should be. And that is very far from what most people imagine democracy should be. And so that democracy is losing its authority, losing its trust. This is not, of course, the defense of Trump or Bolsonaro, anyone. I'm not going to, but it's an attempt to analyze the deep, the roots of the crisis in a kind of common sense prejudice of the intellectual right to govern. I'll just add one last thing. In her essay on violence, where she, I think, articulates this fear of intellectuals more clearly than in any other thing she wrote, there's a footnote at the end, a series of notes at the end. And in one of them, she says that there is that there's simply no reason not to expect the non-intellectuals at some point to violently rebel and destroy and kill the intellectuals in a way that would be no different from race riots, because exactly like racial differences, which are thought to be biological by racists, intellectuals think the other people are morons or deplorables or whatever word you want to use. And she says that it's very likely that the non-elite will rise up in a kind of race war against the elite. I think you're seeing skirmishes along that line around the world today. And I think it was an incredibly prophetic and insightful comment on her part 50 years ago. So I'll stop there. Thank you all. And I'm happy to take questions. I imagine this might be a bit controversial, so we'll see.
No, you have to believe us that everybody is applauding and thanking you. So you are not seeing that, Professor, but you can see Adriana and me. So we are just so grateful.
Great.
I'm going to ask you two questions. Dri, I sent you a question from Ludmila. Take a look at that, because then I'll ask Professor Roger two things, and then you go to another question. Ludmila said, it was great, Roger, as usual, and many people here. But let me ask you something, two things, honestly. When you said intellectuals caught in theories, in theoretical games, don't pay attention to the world around us, I think we can say that, and you made a reference to our work, and it was exactly what we thought, and it's exactly what we think, because that's what happens everywhere. And we see here in Brazil the disconnection between some scholars and universities and other kinds of intellectuals and the world around us. It's something unbelievable. Yeah, so that's why we are here. So thank you so much for this talk. Giselle is saying great. Caroline is saying great. So I'm not going to give you
That's
all
easy for me to answer. I just say thank you.
And the second thing is, before Adriana asks the other questions, is, of course, I have to touch the subject of Eichmann in Jerusalem, because we have been studying here at our lab contemporary Judaism for quite a few time. And for quite some time, to be honest, more than 5-6 years. And then every time we talk about Hannah Arendt, and as we talked before we were here live, Professor, we talked about the prejudices and everything that the Jewish communities around the world feel when they listen to Hannah Arendt. So I would like you to comment about the situation now. What do you think Americans or other nationalities, Jewish nationalities, think about these facts?
About Hannah Arendt and the Eichmann.
Yes, and especially after Eichmann in Jerusalem, of course.
You know, it's a hard question to answer. Largely because I think there's not one answer to it. There's many different Jewish communities. When the Hannah Arendt biopic came out a number of years ago by Margarita von Schratte, you know, I went around everywhere and gave talks after screenings, and you know, I got reactions from "This is amazing" to "You anti-Semite for defending her."
Sure.
I had to in one talk I had to be escorted out by the police because there were people who were so convinced that I was an anti-Semite because I was going to try and articulate Hannah Arendt's points.
I was going to ask you that. Were you escorted from the police? Yeah.
Yeah. So you get a wide range. You know, I think as a general matter, and you know, and this doesn't fit 100%. Liberal Jews generally are more open to these views than conservative Jews. You know, why that is, I don't. You know, partly maybe an attitude of authority, maybe attitudes towards Israel. You know, I think there's a widespread view that she was right about the banality of evil, but wrong about Eichmann. I think that's a line I hear a lot. When you actually try and push people on that and ask where she was wrong about Eichmann, they sort of don't have an answer. But I think that's a view that a lot of people have. You know, I think a lot of people think she was justifying Eichmann, which is hardly the case. She thought he should be killed. I mean, she makes an argument for his hanging at the end of the book. Hardly a justification of him. You know, on the other main controversy, not about Eichmann himself, but about the Judenräte and the Jewish councils and the capos in the camps. You know, again, what she said has been said by many other people. It's not controversial on a factual level. I think the most controversial line that people get upset with is, as a Jew, right? The most, I forget what the word is, the most horrible part of this whole horrible situation was the collusion of the capos and collusion of Jews with the Nazis. And I think people think she's saying the Jews are at fault, which is not what she's saying, I think, at all. But I think that's how it's been widely misread. But yeah, I think there's interest in Hannah Arendt. I mean, 15 years ago when I founded the Arendt Center and I was talking to Israelis, there was no one in Israel reading Hannah Arendt. And now Hannah Arendt is front and center in curricula all over Israel. She's become almost one of the most popular, you know, intellectuals in Israel. And, you know, and yet it's still controversial. Almost every month I get sent an article from Haaretz or somewhere else with somebody trying to destroy Hannah Arendt. She's, you know, a lover of Heidegger. She's a Nazi. She's this. You know, there's a war in Israel over Hannah Arendt, much more prevalent than there is now here, but it's still here. You know, I get it all the time at talks and other events.
Yeah, and I think it's common, as we say, in Judaism is much more common. The discussions are always much more common and more important than the results. So we're always going to be discussing everything related to her, and we are not going to reach a conclusion because, as you said, there is not one Jewish community. There are Judaisms all over. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adriana. Please.
Yes, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's really fun to do this with you guys.
Yeah, and I think this Arendt's intellectual honesty, it's so urgent, so decisive, and I think it's a symptom of our times that it's controversial because it's strange. Scholars usually avoid that approach. It's interesting. But I think it's one of the most important things now to think about this kind of how intellectuals lie, and so it was very good to hear from you this approach. Thank you. I have to hear a question from our friend Ludmila, and from Ludmila Franca Lipk, who is she studies Arendt in University of Berlin. She's here with a question. Please, Roger, today Samuel Moyn wrote on Prospect magazine about the misuses of Arendt's theories on totalitarianism to explain what happened in America since the 2015 presidential elections. He argues that we are missing the point in trying to make comparisons. I tend to agree with him, but I would like to hear your opinion on that, please. How can Arendt explain Trump?
I tend to, you know, I haven't seen this particular article of Sam Moyn's, but I tend to agree with a lot of, I mean, Sam and I have been, you know, two of the people who argued against using the word totalitarian or even fascism to describe Trump. And I've been pretty assiduous in avoiding that, I hope. I wrote a piece in 2017, right when Trump was elected, right after it, attempting to think Trump through Arendt, right? And I think of Trump in an Arendtian sense as someone who is a leader of a movement. I mean, I take him at his word. I mean, one of the things that Arendt always says is take people at their words, right? Don't try and intellectualize it. Say what they believe, what they say. And he says, I'm leading a movement. And, you know, what do you need to lead a movement? One, you need rootless, mass, lonely people. And we have those in great numbers, just as they did in the 1920s and 30s in Europe and the US. You also need a kind of a movement. You need some goal or end. And for Arendt, the key to the main movements of totalitarianism were that they were internationalist movements. They were movements seeking world domination. They actually were against nationalism and national limitations. Trump is hardly an internationalist. He's a nationalist. And so, you know, I think to think of Trump as a totalitarian, I mean, there's a lot of reasons I don't think he's a totalitarian, and certainly not someone who's willing to use terror to make the fictions that he offers real. That's another aspect of totalitarianism that he is not close to yet. So I think it's a real mistake, and I certainly agree with Sam that the sort of overuse and misuse of Arendt in now. I think, I mean, so Sam, people could criticize me for writing a lot about Trump and Arendt. I do, but I mean, what I write about is why Arendt's writing about totalitarianism helps us understand why Trump is not totalitarian and why it requires us to think anew about the situation. I think what Arendt helps us see is that Trump has a kind of movement personality, and he is deeply, he works through this way of creating a fictional, coherent narrative that is actually more comforting to his supporters than the real world. So I think of Trump as someone who's, just like intellectuals have provided a fictional world, has provided his followers another fictional world. I don't think it's totalitarian. I think it's, what word can you use to it? It's incredibly self-serving. It's all about keeping himself in power. I don't think there's a great ideology behind it. He's not an anti-Semite. Unlike a lot of people, I don't think he's a racist in the sense of pushing a racist agenda. I mean, I have no idea of his internal views or anything like that. I don't think he's been, I think what he has done is he's nihilist in a way. I mean, I think I see him as a nihilist. He's willing to use racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim feeling, anti-intellectualism, anti-liberals, anti-intellectuals. He's willing to use any and all of that and throw it against the wall and mobilize whatever sticks. And that's how I see him, as a kind of nihilist, power-hungry, petty, wannabe authoritarian. I don't think Trump's danger is in being an authoritarian. So I'm totally in agreement with Sam there. I don't think he has a lot of power. I think Trump's danger is in his mobilization of social media and of alternative conspiracy theories and alternative realities, which have always been there and are always popping up, but he has brought to the mainstream in a way that is really radical. And while I think one of the reasons he's able to do that is I think that the mainstream story, the mainstream narrative of the intellectuals and the technocrats was also somewhat duplicitous, but it wasn't duplicitous in a nihilist way. It was duplicitous in a idealist way, and they were wrong. They went too far. And the way to respond to that is to argue with it. And instead of arguing with it, he's created a war, a flame-throwing war. And so my worry about him is he's destroying the very fabric of a common sense society in which we actually can talk to each other and will talk to each other. I think if he's not reelected, I think things will, to some degree, calm down, and I think a new normalcy will be emerged. If he's reelected, in 8 years of this, I think the damage will be long term. But I'm a terrible political prognosticator, so you can ignore that. But the basic question from Ludmilla that I heard is, should we be suspicious of using Arendt to understand Trump as a totalitarian? And what I would say is, yes, as a totalitarian, or yes, as a fascist, or yes, as an authoritarian. I don't think he is those things. And I think if you actually read Arendt carefully, you'll learn that she would not think him those things. That he's the leader of a movement, and that he's brought a movement mentality, and thus the fictional coherence and ideological certainty of a movement into politics. That I think he's done. And I think that's dangerous. I don't know if Ludmilla wants to respond or if she can, but I mean, I think it's a good question.
Have you been reading about Bolsonaro, our wonderful Brazilian president?
You know, I read about him, you know, as other people who read the news in a semi-responsible way do. But you know, so I know I knew a little bit about him when he got elected. I knew he, like Mr. Trump, has not been very good around the coronavirus.
You are very elegant, Professor Roger.
But I also
thank you.
One of the things that I also read about him, and you tell me if I read this correctly, is that where Trump's response to the coronavirus has led to a deep decrease in his popularity, I've read that that is not the case with President Bolsonaro, that he's remained incredibly popular. Is that the case?
Kind of.
Yeah.
His popularity, it's not something comparable to Trump, but it declined a little bit, but his popularity is still high. It's a different mentality, yeah.
I'm not sure, you know, I don't know enough about Brazil to explain that. But you know, I think that there's no doubt that President Trump's popularity has taken a huge hit from the coronavirus and his response to it. You know, and so let me say, you know, two of the great, is this all right if I go on to something related to this?
Of course.
Adriana, if there's other questions.
There are, but we can stay here. Can you stay here until 6:30, more of like 40 minutes?
Yeah.
So, okay.
You know, the two of the real great crises of the last year and a half here in the United States have been, one, the impeachment trials of Donald Trump, and then two, the COVID pandemic. And in both of them, he took on and portrayed himself as fighting against the civil service and the technocratic elite. So in the Ukraine scandal around the impeachment, a lot of this started with his lack of interest in providing armed support for Ukrainian Democrats against fighting against Russia, and the civil service and the foreign service in the United States wanted to support them. This was U.S. policy, and he refused. And much of that controversy was around whether we would give money to the Ukrainian, newly elected Ukrainian prime minister to fight against Russia. And so Trump really portrayed himself as fighting against this deep state that was preventing him from stopping a war. And I'll tell you that from an Arendtian point of view, it sounds, I mean, he sounds quite right, in the sense that, you know, he wants to say, why are we spending money fighting a war to bring peace? This is what her question was about Vietnam. And the technocrats say, well, it's a battle of power, and you got to fight this, and you got to fight that, and we went to college, and we went to grad school, and Trump's like, no, I don't want to do it. And so he, you know, yes, he abused his power in trying to shake down the Ukrainian prime minister in order to investigate Biden. There's no doubt he did that. But what people don't realize is that one of the reasons he could win is he portrayed himself as opposed to the civil service and the technocratic elite. And that was a popular position amongst many people. On the COVID crisis, it started out that way. He, you know, the sort of incredible lockdowns that happened around the world were very unpopular. And, you know, maybe some of them were necessary, but, you know, did they go too far? And he was seen by many people as trying to bring some thought or common sense to it and not letting the scientists or the technocrats govern. But, you know, on this one, at some point, the science, the reality of the science just bit him in the rear end. He can't keep lying about it forever and ever because people see their friends dying. And so in this case, the attack on the technocrats, the scientists, and the elites hasn't worked as well as it did in the impeachment crisis. But I think studying the way these two crises both were framed by him as him against the technocratic scientific elite, and how one worked for him and one didn't, is, I think, a potentially productive way of looking at the crisis of democratic politics today. To go back to your question.
Professor Berkowitz, I think we can say that there is totalitarian tendencies, as Arendt says, but not exactly a totalitarian government or.
Yes, but all I'll say, Adriana, is that there's totalitarian tendencies in democracy.
Yes.
I mean, Plato knew that, and Arendt knew that. There's always totalitarian tendencies, and you should always be aware of them, and it never hurts to be aware of them. But and I think, again, I've read a lot of what Sam writes. I have huge respect for him. I didn't read this particular piece, but I think what Sam is saying is stop calling him totalitarian. He's not. I mean, I don't know is that what he said in this particular essay? I know he said that elsewhere. And I fundamentally agree with Sam on that.
We have here another question from Gilbert. What do you think about Claude Lefort's observation about the paradox of democracy? Democracy is the only regime which finds its functioning engine in social division.
It finds its what in social division?
What? Yeah.
It's the only regime that finds its
functioning engine in social division.
Yeah. Only is a word that scares me. As you certainly know, Adriana, Hannah Arendt saw the core principle of the United States Constitution to lie in what she called the Federalist principle, the idea that there was no sovereign power in the United States, and that there was a multiplication of powers. To go back to what I called the second prejudice of liberal democracy, was that it's cosmopolitan rather than nationalist. I mean, there are plenty of nationalist democracies, and there are plenty of especially small, very coherent, ethnically rigid democracies. So, no offense to Claude Lefort, I don't know that even democracy is based in social division. I think federalism is based in social division. I think limited government is based in social division. Montesquieu understood that all limited government is based not only in the division of legislative, executive, and judicial power, but also further divisions, including divisions of different aristocratic elements, which could provide counters to the state. Tocqueville understood that better than anybody, and I think took much of it from Montesquieu. So I would say that limited government, and thus I think free government, because I think free government and limited government are more in line than free government and democratic government, is based in the principle of social division. I think what was unique about the United States Constitution when it was first written is that it was a republican form of self-government with federalist principles, constitutional limitations, and a democratic power element. But it wasn't a full democracy, and it was never meant to be. As it's become more of a democracy, it's become less divided and more centralized, and I think less free. Now, obviously, certain things have made more people free. End of slavery, women's rights, suffrage. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean, but the loss of intermediary and limiting institutions that could challenge the central government has, I think, led to an increasing centralization of power, which has a tendency to limit freedom, not extend it.
And from Carol Batista, very instructive. Thank you so much. Please, I would like you to comment on how you could associate storytelling with political action and the importance of story sharing for common sense.
It's a great question, and it's at the center of Arendt's work, as you know, and I'm sure this questioner knows. It's interesting. The question's a good question because it's got two parts: storytelling for politics and storytelling for common sense. And I'm not sure they're the same. You know, but the stories that we tell, to the extent that we grow up with them and we are raised with them, become what Arendt at one place calls the ground on which we walk and the sky above us. They become our common sense. The stories, you know, they give us a sense of who we are. They tell us, and that common sense is that one sense that fits all of our senses together to the world. They make sense of the world for us. Politics is a strange beast because politics, on the one hand, must conserve that world. And on the other hand, politics is going to change that world and destroy it in some way. Mm-hmm. And so storytelling in politics can have the function of conserving or transforming. And so you can imagine very different kinds of stories told by politicians than told by parents and teachers. You know, teachers are supposed to teach stories of conservation. As our parents, because what they have to do is bring up the child into the world. But politicians teach stories of revolution or change or newness, spontaneity. And now, those aren't as opposed as they may seem, because at least in some countries, and I hope in the United States, and I think in Brazil, part of the stories of conservation of who we are include the stories of revolution and newness and change. And so if part of your story of who you are is that we are a people that is constantly seeking to better ourselves and change, then the political story is actually deeply part of the conservative story. That's how I like to understand this way, the two aspects of storytelling work, at least in most countries, and I think in the United States as well. Mm-hmm. So.
Oh, thank you. I think.
But just one last part to that.
Okay.
The storyteller works in conjunction with the actor or the artist. The actor and the artist puts an idea into the world. They do something. And the storyteller tells a story about it. And it's either a story of rejection, conservation, or of embrace, progressiveness, or revolution. And so the storyteller plays a role in politics, either as a conservationist or a progressivist. I'll stop there.
Okay. One more time, one more question. It's from Christine Lopez. It seems clear that Arendt did not think of herself as an intellectual, but she was an active public voice in the political affairs of her time. So in what sense was she an intellectual? In what sense was she not?
That's a question. Who asked that question? Because that's a great question.
Christine.
Christine, great question.
I'm going to say that Christine is a philosophy scholar. I think the university, she lives in around London, and she participates in our group of contemporary Judaism. That's why I think she's asking this question.
Oh, okay, great.
That's her background, Christine. We are paying attention to you.
So, is Arendt an intellectual? I mean, on one hand, the answer is so obviously yes. It's not even a question. She's about as intellectual as they come. And yet, throughout her life, starting very early, again in the 1930s, very critical of intellectuals. So I don't think that's an oxymoron or anything. I think she's an intellectual who understood the dangers of intellectualism. By the way, the only other intellectual of the 20th century that I know of that was so wary of intellectuals was Friedrich Hayek. So actually in what I talked about today, which were just a bunch of fragmented notes, but are part of a project that includes putting Hayek and Arendt into conversation along this critique of intellectualism. So why was, is she an intellectual? Yes. What she doesn't have is the faith that intellectual knowledge is better than non-intellectual knowledge. She doesn't, what's the guy's name? When she was at Berkeley, when she was at the University of Berkeley, she would write letters back home and say that I hate all the faculty here. I mean, I can't stand them. They're intellectuals. And the one friend she made, I'm blanking on his name, was a guy who worked at the docks, a longshoreman, who was also a writer and wrote, and he wrote some beautiful books of aphorisms. I've actually been reading them with my children recently, but they're brilliant books of sort of common sense wisdom, but with a philosophical bite to it. And Arendt was like, now that's an intellectual. But this is a guy who didn't have a college degree, was working at the docks as a longshoreman. When she writes Eichmann in Jerusalem, she says, if you look at the people who resisted the Nazis, it wasn't the intellectuals. It was often, religious folk, people who were very religious. I don't know if any of you have seen or talked about my favorite filmmaker is Terrence Malick, and his new movie, A Hidden Life, came out about a year ago, if you've seen it. And it's, it's a book about an Austrian Christian who simply refused to serve because of his religious beliefs, of how awful he thought Hitler was. Not pacifism, but how awful he thought Hitler was. And, he's ended up, he gets killed. But it's a brilliant movie exploring the sort of power of a non-intellectual, to think. And there's a great scene in it, two great scenes in it. Once when he goes and meets I don't know the exact figure, the bishop of his area. And, the bishop's like, can't you just sign the stupid thing? And he's like, no, I won't. And you see the sort of corruption of this bishop. And then the judge, who's a very intellectual judge, tries to get him to sign, say, look, we know you're right. Just sign the stupid thing, don't die. And he won't do it. And it's these kinds of stories that I think for Arendt are so important. So while she was an intellectual, I think what she was someone who never believed that intellectuals had an advantage or better than non-intellectuals. Being an intellectual for her was who she was. She was that. But it didn't mean that she had, just like she says that in The Human Condition, politics is too important to leave to the politicians. Thinking is too important to leave to the intellectuals. I don't know if she ever put it in those words, but that's an Arendtian formulation.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's about the difference between knowledge and thinking. And even intellectuals can do the worst evil. Yeah.
That's right. So,
yeah.
I mean, she makes this distinction in a number of places, including The Life of the Mind, but also a number of other essays. I think Thinking and Moral Considerations and others. Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of distinctions. One is between knowledge and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
The one that's even more meaningful to me, and it goes with that, so it fits it. It's more provocative to me, mm-hmm. is that she says that thinking doesn't seek truth. Knowledge seeks truth. Mm-hmm. Thinking seeks meaning. Mm-hmm. And again, this is not something that I see so much in Arendt's scholarship, but to me, I'm asked this a lot. I'm sure a lot of you are. What is Hannah Arendt about? What is the key? And I've had different times had different answers. Freedom, plurality. But I don't think you can talk about Hannah Arendt and not include meaning in that answer. Mm-hmm. Yes, she cares deeply about human freedom. Yes, she cares deeply about human plurality. But in the end, what she basically is saying is what makes us human is not knowing truth. It's having a meaningful life. Which is why she says in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and I think probably the most misread and abused text of hers ever, when she talks about the right to have rights in chapter 9 about mm-hmm. human rights. Mm-hmm. She says the only human right is the right to speak and act in public in ways that people will listen to you and you will matter. It's to be meaningful. If you can speak, and even if you're killed for what you say, you've lived a human life because you've mattered. The worst is to be ignored. And, this is a point that I think Sam Moyne and I will disagree on, right? I mean, on his human rights work, again, which I think is very important. But for Arendt, I don't believe supports a human rights regime that seeks other rights like life or food or shelter. I mean, yes, I think she thinks those things are important, but for her, the only truly human right is the right to matter. And the way mattering is manifested in the world is the right to speak and act in a world where people take you seriously. So yeah.
Another subject. 3 years ago, you faced a very harsh criticism. The Hannah Arendt Center had invited the extremist German politician Mark Jungen, and you supported the invitation, but Mr. Jungen didn't give the conference.
Didn't what?
He didn't give the conference.
Yes, he did.
No, but not in the United States.
He came to Bard and gave a talk. Yeah.
But it was okay. But it was very controversial. You faced a very difficult criticism. How did this situation help explain the problem of bigotry?
Of bigotry?
Yes.
Bigotry.
Bigotry.
I wasn't.
How was this experience for you? All this harsh time.
So,
Discussion.
So as you said in your introduction, Adriana, every year we have a big conference, the Hannah Arendt Center. We usually invite somewhere around 20 speakers. And in the spirit of Arendt, we bring people who we think are intelligent, thoughtful, and yet from very different worldviews, not liberal, not conservative. I mean, it's not that I try and bring one liberal and one conservative, right? That's not my view. My view is bring a philosopher, bring an artist, bring a businessman, bring people from different walks of life who are smart, thoughtful people. And, one group that I usually avoid is politicians because there are very few smart, thoughtful in that category. And I honestly really don't like bringing politicians. They almost never say anything interesting. But in 2000, I don't remember when this was, but I think in 2017 or 18, whenever this happened, it was right after Trump had been elected, and our conference was called The Crises of Democracy. It was very much along, in fact, part of the talk I gave today came out of my introduction to that conference, right? I had to decide who to bring to talk about the crisis of democracy. And I could bring, I brought Masha Gessen, who's a great liberal, currently now a colleague of mine at Bard, who writes for the New Yorker and had sat in on my course on the origins of totalitarianism online. And I think writes great things about the crisis of democracy. And I invited Teju Cole, another colleague, who writes about this, and many others. And I thought it was a great conference. But like with any conference, I thought you got to bring someone who doesn't agree with you. You got to bring someone. So it was a very hard choice because who do you bring? And it was so controversial in the United States. And my students wanted me to bring Steve Bannon. And I was like, oh my God, if I bring Steve Bannon, it's going to be a circus. And my goal is never to have a circus. I'm not interested in circuses. I'm interested in thinking. And so I reached out to colleagues around the world and said, who is smart and anti-liberal, right? Who's an anti-liberal, smart person? And I got a number of names, and one of them was a professor at where is it? Bonn? No, Köln. Wherever it was a professor in Germany, in southern Germany, I think and his name was Mark Jungen. And so I went and read some of what he had written, and he had written some very thoughtful critiques of liberal governance. A little bit in the Schmittian tradition, people don't like it, fine, but he's not he's a thoughtful guy who's published books and articles. And so I invited him, and by the way, I did know that he was involved in the German something called the Alternative für Deutschland, which was a German party at the time, but he was a professor. He accepted, decided to come. About a month before the conference, he got elected to the German Bundestag. Right? But again, most people had never heard of this guy. And that's one of the reasons I invited him, is because I didn't want a circus. And at the conference, it was amazing. I mean, it was one of the most exciting, you can watch it online. He gave a talk. There was enormous criticism of his talk, but he stood there online and on stage and answered the questions. And to me, that's one of the most valuable things we can do. And I think many of the people there thought that this was one of the most extraordinary events they had seen. But afterwards, right, no one complained beforehand. But afterwards, 70 famous people signed a letter saying, you should apologize and you shouldn't have done this. And my response is, you know, who made you the censor? I mean, who told you who can we hear or not? You know, we can have a debate about. My view is you have to listen to people like him. If you can't have if a bunch of intellectuals want to get together and talk about the crisis of democracy and not actually talk to anyone who disagrees with them, what's it going to accomplish? I mean, you know, people say, oh, well, you can read them, you don't have to talk to them. Well, you know, it's so easy to read someone and say, oh, you're wrong, and dismiss it, and here's my argument, and then think you won. But when the students question him and they think they've got this great question and he answers, they realize there's actually disagreement here. Now, they could still disagree. They could still think he's wrong. They could still think he's a bigot, right? And he may be a bigot, right? In some ways, but they may be bigots too. I mean, I would say, is there anyone who's not a bigot in some way? I mean, I don't want to be facile here. To me, here I stand with Hannah Arendt, I think on good ground, although we'll see. One of the great mistakes of what's currently called anti-racism is that it has become an anti-prejudice movement. I think that's an enormous mistake because all humans are prejudiced. The problems are not prejudices. Prejudices are part of the stories of who we are. There are good prejudices, there are bad prejudices. You're never going to get rid of prejudices. And if you try and get rid of people's prejudices, you're going to just alienate people and make them resentful. What you can do is require that they act respectfully of all people in public, and B, you can over time try and show them that their prejudices are wrong. And that's much more effective than saying don't have prejudices. You know, I think I certainly stand behind inviting him. I think it was one of the better conferences we've ever had. And I think having him there is one of the reasons, not because I agree with him, but because it brought a kind of real world experience and engagement with facts that people wanted to deny into the room. And I think it's an absolute mistake. So I try and do this at every conference to bring some one or two or three people who are really outside of the mainstream of that room. You know, and sometimes they're more controversial depending on the topic than others. But no, I think that was I stand fully behind that decision. And I think it was also fully within the spirit of Hannah Arendt. I mean, Hannah Arendt is constantly criticized for citing so many Nazis in her work. And the answer is, as she said over and over again, if you want to understand Nazism, you got to listen to Nazis. You want to understand the liberals, you got to listen to the liberals. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
Right. And you signed a letter published recently on Harper's, a criticism of the cancel culture. And
it was not about cancel culture.
It's not.
Cancel culture wasn't mentioned in the letter.
Oh,
that's what people say. That's what people who don't like the letter say it was about.
Please.
Yeah, the letter didn't mention cancel culture. The letter mentioned, I forget. It's been a little while. It was a call for free and engaged thinking and discourse, and listening to people. Exactly what I was just saying. You know, if you want to know where cancel culture is most prevalent right now, it's in the White House. Anyone that Mr. Trump doesn't like, he cancels. He's, you know, right now he's trying to cancel Dr. Fauci. Who's I don't know if you guys in Brazil all know who Dr. Fauci is, but he's one of our head epidemiologists in the United States. But whenever Trump doesn't like someone, he tries to cancel them. I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong on the left. I think it's wrong on the right. But, you know, I'm not a big fan of these debates around cancel culture because, you know, I think it's very rare that somebody is canceled. I mean, does it happen? Yeah. but it's very rare. I'm more worried about the fact that at Bard College, where I teach, there's probably not one Trump supporting professor. Now, if there were one, I think they're crazy, but I think it's a problem that we are at a college where 60%, 40% of the population is not represented in some way. I mean, everyone's talking about we need more women professors, we need Black professors, Asian. I get it, and I think those are all right. But to say that we don't have one professor who sort of represents, a certain position of 40% of the country seems potentially problematic. Maybe not. I think it is. To me, the letter was about a couple things. It was about the loss of an ethic and a norm amongst especially intellectuals of the left and the center of hearing people who disagree with them and engaging with them. Second, of these people thinking that they are right and know the truth and don't need to listen to people who don't agree with them. And third, a sense that if you do say the wrong thing or represent yourself in the wrong way, you will pay the consequences for it. Not through the government, not through censorship from the government, but from a mob, a Twitter mob. And the fact that people who call themselves intellectuals engage in mob-like behavior is, to me, sad and dangerous. Not for the people who are canceled, because honestly, they find other places to do their thing, but for our public culture. So yeah, I signed the letter. I recruited a lot of people to sign the letter. I recruited people to sign the letter, and one person who signed it, who's a very far, I got a couple of very far people on the left to sign it. And this person said to me, I'm going to take a lot of heat for signing this. I said, yeah. She goes, I'll think about it. And she called me back a day later and said, I'm going to sign it. And you know why? And I said, why? I don't know. She said, because I'm worried that I'm going to get a lot of heat for signing it. And that's why I'm going to sign it. And I said, that's a great reason. Those are intellectual conversations. That's not, I don't like to use buzzwords like cancel culture. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to ask more about it, I'll answer more about it. I just, I'm not a culture warrior. I don't imagine myself a culture warrior. I don't think signing that letter makes me a culture warrior. If it does, so be it. There are going to be people who want to paint me that way. I understand that because I invite Mark Youngin and I sign this letter and I invite other people. But I see the letter standing up for a principle of listening, humble listening, engagement, and a liberal idea. Liberal maybe is the wrong word. An intellectual idea, an honest idea of always questioning your own opinions by listening to people who disagree with you. That's how I took the letter to be. It was a statement for that. And it was a statement to young people that you should have the courage to say what you believe. And those of us who've done it and are in positions of power will support you. That was how I took the letter.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I completely agree with you, and I think that it's very, very easy not to be well. It gets very easy to be an intellectual or to argue something, but only behind the cameras, behind your screen, and behind everything, and you not face everything. You do not face the world. You do not sign anything. So, what is your work for? What are you working for? If you are not facing, if you're not talking to people and signing the things and showing up.
Of course. Yeah. Yes, it is.
Adriana, please.
One last question.
I agree.
Yes. Yeah, perfect. The last question.
Okay.
Please. Arendt wrote about the meaning of politics and the political significance of thought. Do you think cultivating the life of the mind is still meaningful?
Is politically meaningful?
Yeah, it's still meaningful.
Yes.
Thinking, judging.
Yes. Do you want me to say more or just yes? You know, in 2006, so 14, 15 years ago, I organized a conference called Thinking in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt on Ethics and Politics. Mm-hmm. I was not a Hannah Arendt scholar. I had written a book, my first book, didn't even mention Hannah Arendt. Mm-hmm. You know, I had come to Bard where Hannah Arendt is buried and where we have her library, and it was her 100th birthday. So I thought, have a conference, but I don't particularly, this is a hard thing to say, but I've never been someone who reads a lot of Hannah Arendt scholarship. So I didn't want to bring only Hannah Arendt scholars. So we brought like 20 people, and again, journalists, business people, artists, academics, but you know, a couple of Arendt scholars, but not all. And we'd asked a bunch of questions, but the fundamental question is, does thinking matter in politics? Right? Is it matter that people think? And in many ways, that's been the question that has inspired the center and my work for the last 15 years. Why is it matter that people think? You know, and there are a number of answers. You know, in her essay, Thinking and Moral Considerations, you know, Arendt says that thinking has no use in politics except in emergency situations, right? Except when everyone else has sort of stopped thinking and gone along, whether it's technocratically or in a movement or an ideology, the thinker, simply by their inaction or their standing apart from the mob, says to people, you know, in a way that they see and feel, stop and think. And that's one way that thinking matters. She says at the beginning of The Life of the Mind, thinking about the experience of writing Eichmann in Jerusalem, that if it was true that evil in the modern world can only be done with the support of those who do so unthinkingly, which is what she thought of Eichmann, but with banality. Inculcating in people the practice of thinking might, she says, might be the only way to prevent evil. It's another question. Finally, if thinking doesn't seek truth but seeks meaning, it is in thinking that we ask about the meaning of human life or of the existence or of the world. And it is thinking that encourages us to tell stories and create artworks and build institutions that seek to further and explore and support the meaning-making activities of man. And in that sense, thinking inspires the storytelling that inspires the politics that creates a common world that we share together. So those are three ways that thinking matters in politics. I'm sure there's more, but I'll stop there. I can't think of any right now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
So, Professor Roger, we are starting a campaign here in São Paulo, in Brazil, to bring you here next year when all the COVID and everything, we are starting this.
From your lips to God ears, as we say.
Yes. Yeah. So we are waiting for you here.
I'm waiting to come, and I'd love to come, and also love you to come to New York. So we'll figure out a way to do that.
Yes, we'll figure out a way to do that. As Adriana and Labô and everybody is here in São Paulo, we have many researchers all around Brazil, but unfortunately, everybody must come here to São Paulo because, well, I'm going to say some things in Portuguese, but everything is very, very good, so don't worry about it, what I'm going to say. Eu agradeço muito vocês pela participação e eu gostaria de dar algumas informações antes da gente encerrar. Agradecer muito ao professor Roger, a Adriana, e dizer que a Adriana, a gente está lançando um curso com a Adriana que vai começar no dia 18 de novembro, online. O curso chama-se Das Revoluções aos Extremos, a Política Ainda Tem Sentido? Gente, as inscrições estão abertas, é só entrar no link do Kojai, eu vou deixar. O preço do Labô é algo absolutamente irrisório, não é mesmo? É uma coisa simbólica. Vai começar no dia 18 de novembro e são 4 semanas, certo? Espero que vocês possam fazer. Agradeço demais e também até o final do ano teremos um espaço, uma sala Hannah Arendt, no blog, no Oflates do Labô, e muitos eventos ainda por vir. O povo vai falar, mas esse ano está acabando. Gente, para quem? Para quem? Porque aqui no Labô a coisa está fervendo, tá fervendo. Hoje, já às 8 horas, tem outra live sobre diálogo sobre a experiência de Deus, lançamento do livro do André Anéas. Professor Roger,
yes.
Thank you so much again for the 100th time. I'm just thanking you again. And I always say to the people that come to our events that are our guests and the people that we like. And with Adriana, it was the same because she taught a course about Hannah Arendt last year, physically when we were at the university. And I said to her, the moment you start working and lecturing and talking to us, you cannot stop. So you are just connected to us, you know?
I feel deep connection, yes.
Thank you so much. Obrigada a todo mundo. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.